Welcome to Audible Archives. I'm Rob, your host and narrator, and this is a Christmas tragedy rewritten by Raul. At a winter spa, Miss Marple spot a husband who accidentally nearly kills his wife. When a body is found with perfect alibi attached, only she can see how the trick was done. I have a complaint to make, Sir Henry Clittering announced, his voice warm with mischief. His eyes swept the cozy room, twinkling at the company gathered around the fire. Colonel Bantry sat sprawled in his favorite armchair, legs stretched out like a man prepared to court war with the furniture. His brow was furrowed at the mantelpiece as if it had offended him personally. Beside him, Mrs. Bantry pretended to listen, while actually sneaking glances at bold catalogue she'd smuggled into her lap. Dr. Lloyd, courteous as ever, was staring openly, if admiringly, at Jane Hellyer, whose beauty was so effortless it made the firelight seem underdressed. Jane herself was studying her perfect pink nails with all the depth of a philosopher contemplating the universe. Only Miss Marple, upright and composed in her lace fichu and mittens, met Sir Henry's gaze with sparkle of equal brightness. "A complaint?" she murmured, tilting her head politely. "A very serious one," Sir Henry said. "We are 6 this evening, 3 ladies, 3 gentlemen, and yet we've heard 3 stories tonight, all from a man. I must speak on behalf of the downtrodden male sex. The women have not done their fair share." Mrs. Bantry bristled. "Oh, I'm sure we have. We've listened beautifully. The true womanly attitude, not hogging the limelight." "An admirable excuse," said Sir Henry, "but unacceptable. And if we refer to the Arabian Nights, we find excellent precedent." So he bowed slightly. "Forward, Scheherazade." "Meaning me?" Mrs. Bantry gave a helpless laugh. "But I haven't the faintest idea what to tell. I've never been surrounded by blood or mystery." "I don't insist on blood," said Sir Henry, "though it's always welcome. I simply demand that one of you ladies must have a private mystery tucked away. Come, Miss Marple, surely the curious case of charwoman or the enigma of the mothers' meeting? St. Mary Mead must not disappoint." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Nothing that would interest you, Sir Henry. We have our little puzzles, of course. There was that titillating episode of the missing gill of shrimps, but all turn out to be so trivial, though very revealing of human nature." "You've taught me to worship human nature," said Sir Henry solemnly. Colonel Bantry turned to Jane. "What about you, Miss Hellyer? Surely you've had some dramatic experience or other." "Oh, certainly," said Dr. Lloyd encouragingly. "Me?" Jane blinked, as if waking from a slow, luxurious dream. "You mean something that happened to me? Or to a friend?" said Sir Henry, kindly lowering the bar. "Oh, I don't think anything like that has ever happened to me." Jane frowned, then brightened faintly. "Unless you count flowers and odd messages. But that's just men, isn't it?" She drifted back into thought, looking unconvinced. Sir Henry sighed. "I see we must fall back on the epic of the shrimps." "Very well, Miss Marple." "You are too fond of your jokes, Sir Henry. The shrimps are nonsense. But—" She paused, thinking. "Now that I consider it, I do remember one incident. Not an incident, really. Something far more serious. A tragedy." The room stirred, and I was in my small way mixed up in it. "And for what I did," Miss Marple paused, her voice surprisingly firm, "I have never had any regrets. No regrets at all." She folded her mittens primly. "But it didn't happen in St. Mary Mead." That wounds me, Sir Henry lamented, but I shall soldier on. He settled into the pose of a man prepared for storytelling. Miss Marple flushed a shy pink. I hope I can tell it properly, she said. I have a dreadful tendency to ramble. One wanders off the point quite without noticing, and it's so difficult to remember each fact in its proper place. You must forgive me if I muddle the order. It happened, a very long time ago. She took a steadying breath. It was at a hydro. Jane's eyes widened. Do you mean a seaplane? You wouldn't know, dear, said Mrs. Bantry kindly, then explained. Colonel Bantry added gruffly, beastly places. Up at dawn, drinking odious water. A horde of old women gasping all day. Utter torture. Now, Arthur, Mrs. Bantry chided, you know it did you good. Gossiping old women, he insisted. I'm afraid that part is true, said Miss Marple serenely. I myself, my dear Miss Marple. Colonel Bantry sat bolt upright, horrified. I didn't mean you for a moment. Miss Marple stopped him with a small, gracious gesture, cheeks turning rosy. But it is true, Colonel Bantry, Miss Marple said with quiet certainty. Only, before I go on, I'd like to say something. Let me think a moment, yes. She folded her lace-gloved hands primly, but her eyes glimmer with that unmistakable Miss Marple precision. This matter of scandal, talking behind people's backs, as you gentlemen put it, it's done far more often than young people believe. And young people, she added with mild reproach, are terribly severe about it. My nephew, Raymond the writer, has said the most scathing things on the subject. How wicked it is to take away someone's character without proof. How cruel, how Victorian, she sighed. But what none of them ever stopped to ask is it true? Sir Henry smiled. The inspired guess. No, no, Miss Marple said earnestly. Nothing inspired about it. It's practice, experience. Think of an Egyptologist. Show him some curious little coral beetle, and he can tell you instantly if it's ancient or a cheap Birmingham imitation. He can't always explain how he knows. He simply does. A lifetime of observation. She leaned forward slightly. That's what I mean. Women, the kind my nephew calls superfluous women, she gave a tiny sniff of disapproval, have time on their hands, and their chief occupation is people. Not books, not sport, not business. People. So naturally they become experts. And young folk nowadays, well, they speak freely of things that were never mentioned in my day, but for all that their minds are terribly innocent, they believe everyone. They trust everything. And if one tries to warn them, ever so gently, they say one has a Victorian mind. And they say it as if one were a sink. Sir Henry raised his eyebrows. And what exactly is wrong with sink? Exactly, Miss Marple said triumphantly. The most necessary thing in house, but naturally not romantic. A ripple of laughter moved around the room. Miss Marple continued, quite seriously, I have feelings like anyone, and I have been wounded by unthinking remarks. For instance, my maid, Ethel, a beautiful girl, very obliging and a perfect danger to any household. I recognize her type instantly. Just like Annie Webb and poor Mrs. Britt's girl. If the opportunity arose, well, mine and I would be all one to her. So I let her go at the Mont, gave her a perfectly respectable reference, and privately warned old Mrs. Edwards not to take her on. Raymond, my nephew, was shocked, said I'd acted wickedly. She shook her head at the memory. Very unfair of him. What happened then? Asked Colonel Bantry. Oh, she went to Lady Ashton, Miss Marple said serenely. Towards whom I had no obligation. And naturally, Lady Ashton soon found all the lace cut off her underclothes and 2 diamond brooches missing. The girl vanished in the night and has never been heard of since. There was a moment of satisfied silence. Miss Marple inhaled gently, then said, "Now, you will say this has nothing to do with what happened at Keston Spa Hydro, but it has, because it explains why. The very first moment I saw Mr. and Mrs. Sanders together, I felt absolutely certain in my own mind he meant to do away with her." Sir Henry sat up abruptly. Do away with her?" Miss Marple turned her calm, placid face toward him. "Yes, Sir Henry. Make away with her. Murder her." She said it as simply as if she were discussing the proper way to prune hydrangeas. "Mr. Sanders," she went on, "was big, handsome, very hearty, popular with everyone, and no one could be more charming, more attentive to his wife than he was." She paused, let the room breathe. "But I knew—" "My dear Miss Marple," Sir Henry began. Yes, I know," Miss Marple interrupted with a soft, knowing smile. "It's exactly what my nephew Raymond would say. He'd insist I hadn't a shred of proof. But these things happen far more often than people care to admit." She leaned back, her voice calm and devastatingly certain. "I remember Walter Holmes, the man who kept the green man walking home with his wife one night. She accidentally fell into the river, and Walter collected the insurance money. And there are others still walking about free as birds. One of them, I regret to say, from our own class. He went climbing in Switzerland with his wife. I warned her not to go. She only laughed. Thought it funny that a queer old thing like me should suggest her Harry might be dangerous." Miss Marple sighed, a soft, sorrowful thing. Well, there was an accident, and Harry is married to another woman now. But what could I do? I knew, but there was no proof." Mrs. Bantry gasped. "Oh, Miss Marple, surely you don't really mean my dear." Miss Marple said gently, "These things are very common indeed. And men are so much stronger, you know. All they need is a moment and a convenient accident." She folded her lace-gloved hands. "So yes, when I first saw the Sanders together, I knew. It was on a tram. The inside was crowded, so we were all on top. When we got to get off, Mr. Sanders lost his balance and fell straight into his wife, sent her pitching headfirst down the stairs. Fortunately, the conductor was a very strong young man and caught her." "But surely that must have been an accident?" Dr. Lloyd asked. "Of course it looked like an accident. Nothing in the world could have looked more accidental." She paused, eyes bright with quiet fury. "But Mr. Sanders told me he had been in the merchant service, and a man who can keep his feet on a pitching boat does not lose them on top of a tram, when a frail old woman like me does not. Don't tell me." Sir Henry gave a soft, amused whistle. "At any rate, you made up your mind then and there, Miss Marple?" She nodded. "Oh, yes." She hesitated, then added, "And another incident crossing the street shortly afterward made me surer still." She looked around at the circle of faces. "Now I ask you, Sir Henry, what could I do?" Here was a sweet, silly, contented young woman, happily married and shortly to be murdered. Sir Henry stared. "My dear lady, you take my breath away." "That," Miss Marple said primly, "is because, like most people, you simply won't face facts. You prefer to believe such things couldn't be. But they can, and I knew they would. But one is so sadly handicapped." She lifted one hand in a small gesture of helplessness. "I couldn't very well go to police, and to warn the girl would have been useless. She adored him, so I made it my business to learn everything I could. It's quite amazing what one hears while doing one's needlework by the fire." A faint smile touched her lips. Mrs. Sanders, her name was Gladys, was only too eager to talk. They'd not been married long. He had property coming to him eventually, but at the moment they were quite poor. In fact, They lived on her little income. She complained she couldn't touch the capital. There had been good sense somewhere in her family. But the income itself was hers to will away. Miss Marple paused meaningfully. And naturally, the moment they married, they each left everything to the other. Very touching, as I say. Very convenient. She smoothed her skirt and continued. They were living on the top floor among the servants. Quite dangerous in case of fire, though there was a fire escape just outside their window. I asked carefully whether there was a balcony. Balconies, she added softly, are dangerous things. One push. Her voice drifted like a cold draft through the room. So I made her promise not to go on the balcony. I told her I'd had a dream. Miss Marple nodded with a satisfied air of someone who knows how to handle a credulous girl. Superstition is quite useful sometimes. Her expression hardened slightly. She told her husband what I'd said, and I saw the way he looked at me. Not credulous. Not at all. He knew I'd been on that tram, and he knew I'd noticed. But I was very worried, terribly worried, Miss Marple said quietly, because I couldn't see how to stop him. You see, I could prevent anything happening at the hydro simply by dropping a hint, by making him believe I suspected. But that would only delay things. It wouldn't save her. He would simply wait and strike later. Her voice softened, but her eyes sharpened like a scalpel. No, I soon realized only one course was possible. A bold one. I would need to direct the danger myself, draw him into a trap of my own choosing. If I could bring him to tempt her life under circumstances I controlled, well, then he would be exposed, and she would be forced to face the truth, however dreadful. Dr. Lloyd leaned forward. You take my breath away. What conceivable plan could you adopt? Oh, I have found one. Never fear, Miss Marple replied serenely. But the man was too clever for me. He didn't wait. He saw I might suspect, and so he struck before I could be certain. He knew I would distrust an accident, so he made it murder. A small shudder passed around the room. Miss Marple folded her hands tightly. I'm afraid I put that quite abruptly. I must tell you how it happened. I've always felt bitterly about it. It seemed to me I ought to have prevented it, but perhaps Providence knows best. I did what I could. She paused, gathering the threads of memory like a seamstress smoothing creased linen. There was a curious heaviness about the place that week, a sense, absolutely palpable, of misfortune coming. It began with poor George, the hall porter. He'd been there for years, knew every guest by name. Bronchitis, turned to pneumonia, and dead on the fourth day, just before Christmas. It cast a dreadful shadow. She shook her head, and then a housemaid, such a pleasant girl, pricked her finger. It went septic. She died within 24 hours. A murmur of horror arose, but Miss Marple continued steadily. I was in the drawing room with Miss Trollope and old Mrs. Carpenter. Mrs. Carpenter was positively ghoulish. She reveled in it. Miss Marple imitated in a low voice the clicking of needles, the relish of morbid prophecy. Never two without three, she said. Mark my words. There'll be another death, and soon. As she uttered the last sentence, nodding her head and clacking her knitting needles, I happened to look up. Her voice lowered, and there was Mr. Sanders standing in the doorway. Just for a moment he was off guard, and I saw the look on his face as clearly as if it were written. I shall believe, until the day I die, that it was Mrs. Carpenter's dreadful little proverb that put murder directly into his mind. She continued. He stepped into the room, smiling that hearty, genial smile of his. Any Christmas shopping I can do for you ladies? He asked. I'm going down to Keston presently. Miss Marple's face hardened. He chatted a minute or two, then left, and immediately I felt that cold, prickling certainty again. She leaned forward slightly. Where is Mrs. Sanders? I asked at once. Miss Trollope said she'd gone to Mortimer's to play bridge. That eased my mind for the moment, but I was still uneasy. Deeply. Miss Marple let the silence thicken before continuing. About half an hour later, I went up to my room. On the stairs I met Dr. Coles, my physician. As I wished to ask him about my rheumatism, I took him in with me, and it was then in confidence he told me about the poor girl Mary's death, the septic finger. The manager wanted it kept quiet. She sniffed, faintly indignant, as though such things ever could be kept quiet. Everyone had known for hours. A man in his profession should know better than to imagine otherwise. Her voice turned quieter or darker, and that was precisely what alarmed me. His innocence, his simple faith in what he was told. She looked around at them all, for as he was leaving he mentioned, quite casually, that Mr. Sanders had asked him to look at his wife. She had, it seemed, been seedy lately. Indigestion, he said. Miss Marple folded her hands. But I knew better. Oh, yes, I knew. Now that very afternoon, Miss Marple said softly, Gladys Sanders herself had told me, quite proudly, that she had a wonderful digestion and was thankful for it. She let the weight of that detail settle. You understand? That one remark. It brought every suspicion roaring back 100-fold. The man was preparing the way, preparing the story, preparing the alibi, preparing the doctor. She sighed. Dr. Coles had left before I could make up my mind to speak to him. Though what on earth I could have said, I really don't know. And as I stepped out onto the landing, I saw Sanders himself coming down from the upper floor, dressed to go out. Cheerful? Far too cheerful. He asked again if he could fetch anything for me from the town. Her lips pressed into a thin line. It was all I could do to be civil. Miss Marple's voice dropped into quiet gravity of a tolling bell. I went straight to the lounge and ordered tea. That was 5:30. I remember the time exactly. She lifted a finger. And now I must tell this part very carefully. I was still in a lounge at 6:45 when Sanders came in. He was with two gentlemen, friends of his, laughing, a bit lively, in high spirits that felt unnatural, too deliberate. He left them and came directly to Miss Trollope and me. Miss Marple imitated his hearty tone. Ladies, I want your advice. I bought a Christmas present for my wife, an evening bag, and I haven't the faintest idea which one is best. May I trouble you for an expert opinion? We said of course we'd be happy to help, but he asked if we'd mind stepping upstairs. My wife might return any moment, he said. Miss Marple's eyes clouded, so up we went, Miss Trollope and I. We followed him down the corridor. I can still hear the sound of our footsteps and the faint murmur of the Hydro's wireless from downstairs. He opened the door, flicked on a light. She paused, and I don't know which one of us understood first. Her voice lowered to a whisper. Gladys Sanders was lying on the floor, face downward, motionless, heavy, dead. A breath went through the room. I reached her first. Kneeling beside her, I touched her hand. A small shake of the head. It was useless, cold, already stiffening. And there, by her head, was the weapon. She let the horror rest there. A stocking, filled with sand. Miss Marple's voice hardened. Miss Trollope was useless, moaning and fluttering by the door. And Sanders, oh, he gave a tremendous cry of my wife, and rushed toward her. But I stopped him. Her hand made a decisive cutting motion. I would not allow him to touch her. I knew, at that moment, I was certain he had done it, or would try to hide something if he got close enough. Her tone became firm, authoritative. Nothing must be touched, I told him. Pull yourself together, Mr. Sanders. Miss Trollope, fetch the manager immediately. I stayed by the body. I would not leave him alone in that room, not even for a second. And yet, she frowned. I had to admit that the man was acting. He was acting with astonishing skill. He seemed utterly bewildered, stunned, like a man who had seen death leap at him from nowhere. She looked around. The manager arrived quickly. He examined the room, said little, locked the door, and fetched the key. Then he went to telephone the police. A dry smile. We learned afterward the line was out of order, so a messenger had to be sent down into the town. It took ages. And meanwhile, Mrs. Carpenter nearly drove us all mad, preening over a prophecy of never two without three. Miss Marple drew a breath. Sanders, I hear, went wandering out into grounds, clutching his head, groaning as though in unspeakable grief. Her expression said plainly she was not fooled. Eventually the police arrived. They went upstairs with the manager and Mr. Sanders. Then they sent down for me. She nodded. I went up. The inspector was a thoughtful-looking man. I liked him from the first moment. She softened her voice to reproduce his. Miss Jane Marple? Yes. I understand you were present when the body was found. I told him I was, and described every detail with absolute precision. I think, Miss Marple said gently, that the inspector was positively relieved to find someone capable of answering his questions sensibly. Poor man. He'd just been wrestling with Sanders' theatrics and Emily Trollope's hysterics. She was completely demoralized. Naturally, she would be the silly creature. Her voice softened, the hint of a memory stirring. My dear mother always taught me that a gentlewoman should control herself in public, however she may collapse in private. Sir Henry bowed his head. An admirable maxim. Miss Marple continued. When I had finished giving my account, the inspector said, Thank you, madam. Now I'm afraid I must ask you to look at the body once more. Is this exactly how it was lying when you entered? Nothing has been moved? I explained that I had prevented Mr. Sanders from touching his wife. The inspector nodded approvingly, I thought. She leaned forward slightly, imitating the quiet exchange. The gentleman seems terribly upset, he said. He seems so, yes. I didn't stress the word seems, but he looked at me rather sharply. So, Miss Marple went on, he asked again if the body was untouched. Except for the hat, yes, I told him. Miss Marple lifted her eyebrows. That startled him. The hat? He snapped. I explained. When we first found Gladys, the red felt had been on her head. Now it was lying beside her. I had assumed the police had removed it. But no, they insisted they had touched nothing. The room seemed to hold its breath as Miss Marple described the scene. There she lay, poor Gladys, in her dark red tweed coat with the gray fur collar, the cheap little red hat beside her head like some forlorn, discarded thing. The inspector stood a long time frowning down at her. Then suddenly he asked, Could you recall whether she was wearing earrings? Did she usually wear them? Fortunately, I observed things. I remembered a glint, pearl drops, just below the brim of her hat. I hadn't consciously taken note of them at the time, but I could answer him immediately. She nodded. Yes, she had earrings on. And that, Miss Marple said, settled everything. Then the jewel case has been rifled, he declared. Nothing very valuable, but still. And the rings have been removed from her fingers. The murderer forgot the earrings and came back for them after the body was found. A cool customer, unless, he looked slowly around the room, unless he was here all the time, concealed. Miss Marple shook her head firmly. No, I had already looked under the bed. The manager had opened the wardrobe doors. Anywhere a man could hide had been checked. The only locked compartment was the hat cupboard, and that was shallow shelving. No human being could possibly have been squeezed into it. She mimed the inspector's thoughtful nod. "Very well," he said. "I'll take your word for it." In that case, he came back later, quite coolly. Miss Marple lifted a single prim finger, but the manager locked the door and took the key. I told him. "Ah," she said, her voice rich with irony. The inspector merely smiled and said, "That's nothing. The balcony, the fire escape, that's your answer. When you arrived, you may have disturbed him. He slips out the window, and when you all leave, he returns and finishes his business." Miss Marple paused. I asked him if he was certain it was a thief. Her voice deepened, reproducing the inspector's dry tone. "Well, it looks like it, doesn't it?" She looked around the room of listeners, but something in his voice reassured me. He wasn't buying Mr. Sanders' performance. Not for a moment. The moment Doubt entered the room, Miss Marple folded her hands primly, her gaze steady and thoughtful. "You see," she said, "I admit it frankly now, but at the time, I was utterly consumed by what the French, I believe, call an idée fixe, an obsession, a conviction that rooted itself so firmly in my mind that it colored everything I saw." She paused, letting the room feel the weight of that confession. I knew Sanders meant his wife to die. Of that, I was completely and confidently certain. And indeed, my judgment of his character was perfectly correct. He was a scoundrel, a dangerous man, a man who hid his cruelty behind hearty manners and a florid, jovial face. Her voice softened, reflective. But even so, when he discovered the body, the surprise, the bewilderment, yes, even a horror seemed so natural, so utterly unforced. I remember thinking, if he is acting, then he is one of the greatest actors alive. Miss Marple sighed, and then doubt came creeping in. She lifted her eyes to the listeners, because even if Sanders had murdered his wife, it made no sense at all, that he would creep back along the fire escape just to remove earrings from her ears. The act was foolish, unnecessary, and dangerous. And you see, Sanders was never foolish. That was what made him so frighteningly capable. Her audience leaned in. "You see, perhaps, where I'm going?" Miss Marple asked gently. "In this world, it is so often the unexpected that proves to be the truth. My certainty had blinded me, and the truth, when it came, shocked me utterly." She paused, then dropped a revelation like cold water. For it was proved, beyond any possible doubt, that Mr. Sanders could not, by any stretch of time or logic, have committed the murder. A collective gasp. Mrs. Bantry's was the loudest. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "I know, my dear. It wasn't what you expected. It wasn't what I expected either. But facts are facts. And when one finds oneself wrong, one must simply be humble enough to begin again." She folded her hands. "That Mr. Sanders was a murderer horrid, that I never doubted and never will. But the death of his wife? Ironically, he was innocent of that particular act." She drew a quiet breath and began recounting the evidence. Mrs. Sanders had spent the afternoon playing bridge with the Mortimers. She left them at 6:15. The walk to the hydro took perhaps 15 minutes. 10 if one hurried. She must have entered around 6:30. No one saw her. She must have slipped in by the side door and gone straight upstairs. She changed her clothes. The fawn coat and skirt she worn to her bridge game were hanging neatly in her wardrobe, and was, by all appearances, preparing to go out again when the blow came. Her voice lowered. "The sandbag, they say, is a terribly efficient weapon. Perhaps she never even saw her attacker. The police believe the killer had been hiding in the room, concealed in one of the large wardrobes. The one wardrobe she didn't open." She continued, "And now Mr. Sanders. He left the hydro around 5:30. He was seen in shops. At 6 o'clock he entered the Grand Spa Hotel, where he encountered two friends, Hitchcock and Spender, men I dislike intensely, unpleasant, vulgar, and certainly not gentlemen. but they were telling the truth. Oh, that I was convinced. Miss Marple's tone sharpened. They played billiards. They drank. And from 6 o'clock onward, those two men never left Sanders' side. He walked back with them. He left them only at 6:45 when he came to fetch Miss Trollope and me. And at that time his wife had already been dead. She looked around the circle. So you see, Sanders could not have killed her. Not unless he had the ability to be in two places at once. She folded her hands again, serene, but her eyes gleamed with the satisfaction precision. The hat that shouldn't have fit, Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle yet sharpened with that unmistakable steel beneath. There was just one other point, she said, a very small point at first glance, but I have found that the smallest details are often the most important. She folded her hands. Thinking back, it seems that during the bridge game, Mrs. Sanders was called to the telephone. The caller gave a name Lilworth, a name she clearly didn't recognize. She repeated it, puzzled. Yet when she returned to her card table, she was blushing, smiling, so flustered she made several mistakes. Miss Marple shook her head. That does not sound like a woman speaking to someone she knows. It sounds like someone who has been flattered, someone who has been told something intriguing, perhaps something illicit, and therefore someone using a false name. Sir Henry leaned forward. Go on. Sanders denied ever hearing of Littleworth, Miss Marple said, and from his wife's reaction, that seems true. Yet whoever called her made her eager, almost excited to leave early. So the question remained, who was she going to meet? And did that someone climb up the fire escape to her room? Did they quarrel? Or did he simply take the first opportunity to silence her? She stopped abruptly. Well, Sir Henry asked, was the answer? Miss Marple looked at each face in turn. I wondered, she said quietly, whether any of you'd guess. Mrs. Bantry threw up her hands. I'm hopeless at guessing. Only, what a pity Sanders had such a perfect alibi. Then Jane Hellier, who had been silent, lifted her beautiful head and said softly, why was the hat cupboard locked? Miss Marple beamed as though Jane had recited Shakespeare. How very clever of you, my dear. That question is the heart of the entire case. The room leaned in. The explanation, however, was quite simple, said Miss Marple. Inside the cupboard were Christmas presents, embroidered slippers and handkerchiefs Mrs. Sanders was making for her husband. Naturally, she locked them away. The key was found in her handbag. Jane's face fell. Oh, then it isn't interesting after all. Oh, but it is, Miss Marple said. It is the most important detail. It is the detail that ruined the murderer's entire plan. Every face tightened with curiosity. For 2 days, Miss Marple said, I puzzled over it, and then suddenly it came to me in a flash. She leaned forward, voice low, almost conspiratorial. I went to the inspector and asked him to try something for me. He humored me, and that proved everything. Sir Henry said softly, what did you ask? Miss Marple smiled. I asked him to fit the hat on the poor girl's head. She let the silence stretch. And of course it wouldn't go on. It didn't fit, because it wasn't her hat. A stunned silence fell. Mrs. Bantry whispered, but you saw it on her head when she was found? Not on her head, Miss Marple corrected gently. Beside it, and the hat had been used to conceal the face. A long breath shivered to the room. Miss Marple continued, you see, we assumed that the body was Gladys Sanders, but none of us saw the face. She was lying face downward, and the hat hid everything. Sir Henry said slowly, but she did die. Yes, said Miss Marple. Later. She let that sink in. At the very moment we were telephoning the police, Gladys Sanders was alive and well. Colonel Bantry blinked. You mean someone was pretending to be her? But surely when you touched her, oh, it was a dead body, said Miss Marple gravely. Quite dead, but not hers. Colonel Bantry sputtered. But you can't get hold of dead bodies just like that. What happened to the first corpse afterwards? Miss Marple's voice softened with grim certainty. He put it back. The room inhaled sharply. It was wicked and clever, she said. He used the body of poor Mary, the housemaid. Remember, Sanders' room was among the servants' quarters. Mary's room was only 2 doors away. The undertakers weren't coming until after dark. He counted on that. Their faces froze as a picture formed. In the early dusk, Miss Marple said, he carried Mary's poor dead body along the balcony, dressed it in his wife's red coat and dress, then found the hat cupboard locked, and so he snatched one of Mary's hats instead. No one would notice. He laid the sandbag beside her and walked away. Her voice dropped, dark and final. And then he went out to establish his perfect alibi. Little worth the alibi and a hat that wouldn't fit. Miss Marple's voice softened, but the room leaned in as though the next words were scalpel about to cut to the last layer of deception. He telephoned his wife, she said, calling himself Mr. Lilworth. I don't know precisely what he said, but she was a credulous girl, easily flattered, easily led. Whatever the message was, it thrilled her. She left the bridge party early and didn't go back to the hydro. A cold shiver threaded through the listeners. He arranged to meet her outside, Miss Marple continued, near the fire escape, at 7 o'clock. I imagine he told her he had a surprise for her, something romantic, something she wanted desperately to believe. Her voice grew brittle. He returned to the hydro with his 2 friends, his witnesses. He showed us the 3 handbags on approval, played the part of the jovial, loving husband, and then very generously he invited Miss Trollope and me upstairs to choose a gift for his beloved wife. Her eyes darkened. What he really wanted was witnesses. Witnesses would discover a body. She swallowed. We entered the room, and there she was, face down, still cold. Not her, but we did not know that yet. Miss Marple pressed her hands together tightly. He pretended to rush to her, pretended to turn her over, and I, thinking I was preserving evidence, stopped him. How little I knew, how proud I was of my vigilance. The disgust in her voice was gentle but profound. Then the police were called. Sanders staggered outside, clutching his head, playing grief like a trained actor. A long, painful silence. And at that very moment, Gladys Sanders, alive, was walking to the grounds to meet her husband. Jane Hellier covered her mouth with her hand. Miss Marple's tone dropped to a whisper. He took her up the fire escape. The line to the police station was conveniently out of order. He made sure of that earlier. And so, in the room where he had staged her murder, he killed her. Quickly. A single strike with the sandbag. She closed her eyes briefly, as if steadying herself. He stripped off her coat and skirt, hung them neatly in the wardrobe, then dressed her in the clothes he had taken from Mary's corpse. Dr. Lloyd muttered, "Good God, the hat," Miss Marple said, her voice returning to its usual firmness, was his undoing. Gladys had thick hair, rolled up in a bun. Mary's was shingled short. The hat would not fit. She shook her head sadly. He left her beside the body and hoped no one would notice. Sir Henry murmured, "And no one did." Miss Marple nodded. Then he carried Mary's body back to her room and arranged it carefully to await the undertaker. A dreadful, wicked idea, but undeniably clever. Dr. Lloyd paced by the fireplace, troubled. He risked everything. The police could have arrived early. The line was down, Miss Marple reminded him. He made quite sure the police could not arrive quickly. When they did come, they spent time below with the manager. The time difference between a woman dead 2 hours and a woman dead 30 minutes would go unnoticed. Dr. Lloyd sighed. Yes, that's true. Miss Marple looked down at her hands. I should have known. Her hand was icy cold when I touched it. You know, ice cold. And yet minutes later, the inspector spoke as though the murder had been done just before we arrived. She shook her head softly. I saw the truth, and yet I didn't. Sir Henry cleared his throat. What happened? Miss Marple looked him straight in the eye. He was hanged, and rightly so. She took a breath. I have never regretted the part one played in bringing him to justice. What I have regretted, bitterly, is that I could not save that poor girl. But who would listen to an old woman? Jump in conclusions? Her tone grew unexpectedly tender. Perhaps it was mercy. She died while she still loved him, before she had to learn that the world could be so cruel, before the man she trusted was revealed as the monster he was. Jane Hellier's voice, quiet and trembling, slipped into the silence. Then she was lucky, she whispered. Quite lucky. Her voice trailed off, the emotion catching unexpectedly in her throat. Miss Marple studied her with a gaze far sharper and far kinder than anyone had expected. Yes, my dear, she said softly. I understand. The room held its breath. Miss Marple nodded gently. I see. You've been listening to A Christmas Tragedy, hosted and narrated by Rob, rewritten for Audible Archives by Raul. If you enjoyed Miss Marple outsmarting a killer with a perfect alibi, like, comment, and subscribe. And stay tuned for more classic mysteries, reborn in audio.